Morning, everybody. My name is Elena Valker, and I'm the chair of this session. I have the pleasure to have the semi-plenary speaker, Jason Marden, pardon me, and his talk is Recent Advances in Colonel Blotto Games. I will give a brief presentation of the speaker. I wish I would be able to memorize all this stuff, but it's such a long and excellent curriculum that I have to use my notes. So Jason is a full professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Santa Barbara in California. He received the Bachelor in Mechanical Engineering in 2001 from UCLA. Subsequently, in 2007, he received a PhD in Mechanical Engineering, again at UCLA, under the supervision of Jeff Shamma, and he was awarded the Outstanding Graduating PhD Student in Mechanical Engineering. After graduating from UCLA, he moved to the Social and Information Sciences Lab of Caltech, where he was a junior fellow until 2010, when we moved to the University of Colorado. In 2015, Jason joined the University of Santa Barbara again, and he was the recipient of the ONR Young Investigator Award, the NSF Career Award, the AFOSR Young University Award, and the Ekman Award in 2012, and the Siam SGT Best Second Paper Award in 2015. Now you understand why I would not be able to memorize all this stuff. So Jason's research interests focus on game theoretic methods for the control of distributed multi-agent systems, and it's a real pleasure to have him here as a speaker. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I think thank you guys for all attending. I think it goes without saying that it's wonderful to have a conference not on Zoom and be back in person again. So I thank the organizing committee for all their hard work, and here I'm honored to be able to speak to you guys a little bit today about some recent advances in Colonel Blotto games. So it was maybe 4 years ago. I was at the American Control Conference. I heard a talk on Colonel Blotto games, become a little bit fascinated with the underlying simplicity of the model, yet the richness of the questions, and I hope I can convey some of these ideas to you today to potentially, hopefully, excite a little bit more interest in this area. All right, so I got instructions that I need to click in order to potentially make it work. Okay, there we go. So before moving forward, just want to acknowledge the contributors to this work. So on the far left, we have Keith Parporn. So he was a postdoc in my lab, is now kind of an assistant professor at the University of Colorado Springs starting this fall. So he was kind of the architect behind all the work here, and highly contributed with my graduate student Rahul, my other student postdoc Adal, as well as two supporting colleagues is Professor Dan Kovanoff, who's an economist over at Chapman, and Professor Manish Alibata. All right, so just a little bit of brief history on kind of my university. So I'm from UCSB. So ideally kind of located right there on the coast. I don't need to share much about kind of, I think UCSB within this community, but kind of we have 23,000 undergraduates, 3,000 graduates. But I think what I want to highlight with this picture is geographically where we're located. And so we're right on the coast, and the coast opens up a spectrum of opportunities that draw people to Santa Barbara. We're the 6th ranked surf college, kind of world-class rock climbing, mountain biking, sailing, and all sorts of fun stuff. So it's not all positive, though. Some of the being on the coast also provides a degree of challenges, and one of these challenges has been actually drug smuggling, right? So Santa Barbara's had a long history or problems associated with people smuggling drugs in via, right? And so we got the good, we got the bad. And so if you look at just the terrain of what do we have is we have a lot of coastline that Coast Guard are responsible for maintaining. And they're not always able to be successful, yet in many cases, there has been a variety of success stories over time. And over the last 2 years was one of the largest success stories that we had. So basically in 2021, basically over 3,000 pounds of meth was seized off the coast. Right. And so this was one of the success stories associated with the Coast Guard. There's been more since then, but it just shows that this coastline is active for this form of behavior, and one needs to kind of help prevent it. And so one of the sentences that kind of sticks out to me most in this article is the sentence that I'm highlighting right there, is that the Coast Guard is beating the drum for more research. Right. It's saying, hey, the coastline is vast. We need to protect it all. We just don't have enough manpower to do it. Okay. And so when you start to think about this, is the Coast Guard not alone? We're in a budget constrained environment, right? We don't have infinite amount of resources. We need to make do with what we have. So I think alternatively, maybe to asking this question, so it'd be great to get more resources, but really the theme of this talk is going to center on, in a case where we do have limited degrees of resources, well, how should we efficiently utilize it? That's really what we want to think is, hey, if we can get more, great, but let's make sure we're employing what we have in the most efficient way. Okay, so this isn't something, this question of how should we efficiently allocate a limited amount of resources is not something that's just restricted to the Coast Guard. You know, you can talk about conservation, you know, it's the preservation of wildlife and the elimination of poachers, to obviously crime and security and even in markets, is people are constantly tasked with how do I allocate a limited degree of the resources in the way that interests me the best. Right. And so that's what this talk is going to be about. And so there's been a rich area of research in both applied and theoretical research. And I put down a bunch of names, and I could probably put down the names of everybody in this audience as well, who somehow has contributed to this idea of resource allocation. And it's, you know, we have applied and we have theory. And on the applied side is people are focused on, well, how do I take problems of interest, model it, come up with implementable strategies, and how do they perform relative to the state of the art? And there's been huge advances on that front as well. On the theoretical side, people have tried to look at, well, could I extract out what are maybe the salient features of the optimal allocation policies, with the idea of maybe aiding the applied and the computational side, or providing opportunities for advancement, you know, in enriching or thinking about new ways that we could potentially go about these problems. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to focus more on the theoretical side, right? Think about trying to understand what is kind of the salient features of the underlying problems and the allocation strategies that we're after. So throughout this talk, what we're going to try and do is ground our kind of analysis and our discussion in this area of kernel blotto and general blotto games. And if you've never seen it before, I'll introduce it. They're very simple, but we'll kind of spruce them up a little bit in terms of their sophistication as we go along. But basically, kernel blotto and general blotto games are just a popular model of competitive resource allocation problem, and they've been studied for 100 years. Okay, and so really what we have over here is we're going to have this depiction throughout of blue versus red. How we should interpret this, we have two opposing entities, the blue entity and the red entity, that are competing over a given number of fronts. And those fronts are what's highlighted with those boxes here. And here what I'm showing is those fronts could have differences in heterogeneity with regard to how much they're. Okay, we'll go once again, we'll go through the model in detail later on. But that's the general picture of what we have over here. And they're competing over those fronts with a limited degree of resources. And here we'll think about XA being the resources available to A and XB being the resources available. All right, so before delving into any form of detail, what I'd like to do is spend 5 minutes and give you an overview, a high-level picture of kind of the 3 contributions that I want to highlight. And then we'll start delving into the details a little bit on. So if you're interested, at least this next 5 minutes will kind of give you a blueprint for what's. So one of the first things that we started to do was to think about this classical model of kernel blotto, but to go into an incomplete information world. So here, what we actually did was kind of look at kind of asymmetric information in kind of an extreme perspective, where these 2 agents are competing over these numbers of fronts. One agent is fully informed about the state of the world, and one agent is not informed about it. Now, so what we were able to do was provide a characterization of the equilibrium and the payoffs and stuff like that. Now, why did we seek to do that? Is we sought to do this once again, along with the theme of this talk, of how do we efficiently utilize our available resources. Here, we're starting to think about going from an incomplete to a partial information to full information as a way to utilize them better. And what do I mean by that is what such a characterization allows us to do is to assess the value of information. What do I mean by value of information is how does red's equilibrium payoff change as it goes from knowing nothing about the state of the world or just having information about it prior to as we move up to full information. Meaning, you know, if red is going to invest in something to improve the utilization of its assets, should it invest in more assets or should it invest in better information? Neither one of those 2 things are free. This now starts to give us a mechanism to try and get on. Okay, so that's going to be the first kind of contribution, and probably the one that I'll spend the most time in, is just setting up this model and providing you the characterization. But really, why are we doing this? It all centers on this idea of value information. We want to utilize things better. Information potentially is an avenue to do that. The second problem that I wanted is a variant of this. We can think about this as a one level up, and what this is known as is something called the commander assignment problem. And so the idea is, once again, is think about this, you know, in each one of these, we have all these different tasks, and I'm representing these tasks as Blotto games in this particular case, at least pictorially, which means these tasks might be operating in an adversarial environment. Okay. Now, what are you tasked with? A central commander is tasked with, it has a fixed pool of assets. And what it has to try and figure out how to do is, how do I divide that fixed pool of assets over these multiple independent tasks? Once again, we're budget constrained. We don't have an infinite degree of resources. In this case, I'm showing two underlying tasks, task 1 and task 2. How many resources do I want to associate to task 1? How many do I want to associate? Okay. All right. I saw that it was blinking red. I saw yours was blinking green. I thought it might be about. All right. So is this better? Okay. Oh, there. All righty, online. Okay. So the idea is, once again, is how do I divide this fixed pool of resources among these multiple independent, right? How do I allocate? And so here, what we were showing, and I think this was kind of interesting, is this idea that actually randomization in assignment, right, can actually lead to significant gains in performance. So what does that mean? Is if I'm budget constrained, so I have X assets that I can divide among these two tasks, allocating it in a random fashion can actually yield me performance guarantees that are twice as high. An expectation is the best deterministic one. Now, what do I mean by random ones? I'm going to show you an extreme picture of what a random distribution could be. Is flip a coin, put everything on the right, flip a coin, if it shows up heads, if it shows up tails, put all the resources on the left. So that's an extreme version. I'm not saying that that's the right one, but all that I'm saying here is that actually randomization can be extremely valuable as a way to eke out as much benefit as possible out of that set of resources. Okay. Now, the third one is, I think, where kind of controls, and we're starting to move in this direction in the Blotto literature, is moving to problem settings and problem structures that are much more common and meaningful to some of the applications that we're dealing with, such as like network defense. Okay, so when we think about the classical setting of kernel Blotto, what do we have is these agents are competing, these entities are competing over these different fronts, and typically objectives are summable. What does that mean? Is that we go through each front and we say, okay, the performance on front 1, you know, given their local allocation on front 1, here's how much the benefit was derived from each one of those agents. And we go through each one of them, and typically the payoff of the two agents is just the sum over their benefit on. Okay. Well, recently one started to move in new directions. So some objectives can't capture everything. In some sense, viewing these battlefields or these fronts as independent is probably, in many cases, not the right thing to do. And so we started to see alternative formulations show up in the literature, maybe 5 to 10 years ago. And those formulations took on this idea of weakest link defense. And so here the idea was the following: it's that now blue only derives benefit if it wins all the fronts, if it succeeds on all the fronts. If it loses even one of the fronts, then all of a sudden it's a win for red. Okay. So moving into a way where winning one in isolation doesn't garner me any benefit, rather I need to win them all. Okay, and what this is known as the weakest link, and one can see that clearly this formulation has applications to security, right? If I'm breached anywhere, the system goes down, right? So I would like to prevent that. Now, where have we taken things is taking it more to a network level, right? So what do we have is we have, you know, blue and red are now allocating over fronts. We think of fronts maybe as nodes in an underlying network, right? And what does blue want to do is maybe blue derives benefit if it wins various subsets of nodes. So for example, suppose that it wants to connect a source to a destination and it needs to win the nodes, which are going to act as relays along. Okay, and so what we've been able to do is extend some of this equilibrium characterizations to structures that more resemble that have these types of network structures underpinning them, right? But moving away from the idea of viewing each of the battlefields as independent, winning one in its own right doesn't give us anything. Rather, there's various subsets that have worth, and how does that change how I would choose to allocate my resources? And so the significance really in here is when we think about equilibrium characterizations, is what does that do? It tells us something about budget versus performance frontier, right? So here I have some level of budget. Here's my equilibrium payoffs. If I increase my budget, how much performance is it going to give me? Is it worth that investment? Yes. All righty. So that kind of provides a little bit of a blueprint for what this talk is going to be about and kind of what are the contributions. And now we'll start delving into a little bit more of the details. Okay. So once again, we talked about kernel Blotto games. We have two opposing entities competing over a given number of fronts. So here our entities are blue and red, and the fronts are the boxes which have values V1 and V2. Okay. So here what we assume is that each of these two agents has some form of budgets or assets at its disposal. And so we'll assume that the blue one has XA, which is some number greater than or equal to 0, and the red has XB. Okay. Now they're going to have to allocate those assets over the fronts that they have, or the fronts that they're competing over. What's an allocation? An allocation is just a division of their budgets. Kind of some form of an allocation where what are we doing is we're allocating some amount to each one of the fronts. That amount is going to be greater than or equal to 0. And what do we know is the cumulative allocation can't exceed our budget. So we're just, in some sense, living somewhere on the symbol. And what's our payoff? The classical payoff in kernel Blotto is what do? We go through each one of the fronts, right? Each one of the fronts has an underlying value. So here we're going to state the payoff for player A. We're going to say, well, it has some value V of J, whatever that J is. And then we're going to look at, well, did player A allocate more to that particular front than player J or than player B? If it did, it accrues the full valuation. If it didn't, it gets 0. If it ties, maybe we split it. Okay. And what this is referred to as the winner take all kind of rule, meaning that if I allocate more than you at a particular front, I accrue the value of that. Okay. There's alternative kind of scoring rules that one could have. It's a rich theory called these contest success functions, which is just saying a mapping from given my allocation to your allocation, here's the payoff I derive. But for this talk, we're just going to concentrate on winner take all to keep things a little graphic. Okay. And one can obviously see the models of this, whether we talk about conservation, we could have resources being our rangers and equipment, allocations are maybe geographically where we put them, payoff is some notion of area secured. If we're in airport security, agents and surveillance, we have a parallel story. Okay. So let's just spend a couple minutes just warming up to make sure that the model is clear. Okay, so here, once again, we have blue and red. Blue has 3 assets, red has 5 assets. And there's 2 battlefields, 1 and 1. So what do we see here is they have asymmetric budgets. Red is stronger than blue in this particular case. And they're competing over 2 fronts, and those 2 fronts in this case are homogeneous. So they're both of worth 1. Okay. And just to make sure that we're clear on the model, suppose blue allocated 2 to the left front and 1 to the right front, and red allocated 3 then 2. What do we have is red would win both of the fronts. So red would secure a payoff of 2. Blue would secure a payoff of 0. Okay. Well, similarly, if blue allocated 1 and 2, and the other one was 4 and 1, now blue would win the front on the right, and they would both secure a value. Okay, pretty simple. So let's revisit this question. So if you're the blue agent, like what would you do? How would you choose to allocate your 3 units of resources to optimize your pay? And when I use the word optimize your payoff, that's loaded, right? Because your payoff is contingent upon what the red person is doing. So here, what we could think about is, well, maybe you're going to optimize your worst case. You're going to take a very pessimistic view, and I'm going to try and optimize my worst case. Okay. And so what do we see here is, well, any deterministic strategy that blue kind of puts forth can be completely overwhelmed by red. Completely overwhelmed by red. So that means from a deterministic perspective, like blue can't guarantee anything in a worst case. However, one can start to think, well, what about random? Right? What if blue allocated its resources in some form of random? And let me, once again, an idea is blue flips a coin. If the coin shows up heads, puts all 3 units on the right. If blue, if it's tails, all units on the left. And we can start to think about, well, what would happen according to this distribution? And so notice that even if red is aware of this distribution, red can no longer overwhelm both resources all the time. Yeah, right? On one of these resources will be less than 3, right? And what does it mean is blue's going to win that at least half the time, right? So what do you see is by employing some form of a random strategy, blue is actually, in a worst case sense, is able to bump their payoff all the way to 0.5. Right, which when we're thinking about these ideas of zero sum and constant sum games is not surprising that randomization plays. Okay, and so here this turns out, in fact, for this case, to be in some sense the optimal randomization strategy. And what I want to highlight here is randomization plays a fundamental role in providing some form of efficiency guarantees in this type of system. All right, so when we think about kernel Blotto games, all the work is centered on. Is centered on deriving optimal security strategies of this form. What are we trying to do? We're trying to do some max min, where we're maximizing over our randomized strategies. We're then doing a minimization over allocations of red and trying to maximize the underlying that we can. Okay. So when we start thinking about what is this randomized over, that kind of changes the landscape of where the Blotto literatures live. So one could think about in this particular case, we randomize. We pick a strategy SA that has support over all integer allocations. So 3, 0, 2, 1, 1, 2, and 0, 3. So this is, how many am I sending to the left? How many am I sending to the right? And so one could pose it that way. And this typically isn't where a lot of the work relies. We can solve this using linear programming. The action sets grow exponentially. We don't typically have closed form solution. And we lose the ability to get precise analytical insights about what. So the bulk of where the Blotto literature is resided is when we look at mixed strategies that has support over our continuous allocations or simplex. So here we're going to view this 3 for blue as something that can be arbitrarily divisible, right? So we can think about the simplex over there. Well, in this particular case, since it's only 2, it's just going to be a line, and I'll highlight what that line would be later. So we're going to look at divisions like that, and then what we're going to look at is we're going to look at probability distributions that live over that simplex. Right, and that's going to be where the typical structure for kernel Blotto work lies, right? Is continuous allocations, and we're going to look at probability distributions that live over those simplex. Okay. So these were first studied and kind of the first gains were had back in the 50s with Gross and Wagner. And so what they were able to do was nail the two kernel, 2 battlefield, and give you closed form solutions for what that looks like. And so here, in this 3-5 example that we've looked at many times before, it turns out that the distribution that we talked about before is precisely what comes out of their analytical characterization. We get these point mass distributions. So here I'm just highlighting what we're sending to battlefield 1. You can figure out what we're sending to battlefield 2 just by subtracting 3 and so this is what we have over here, right? So it turns out half the time send 0 to battlefield 1, half the time send 3 to battlefield. Okay. So alternatively, if we start to change things around, suppose that 3 was centered to a 4, right? Here's what the distribution looks like now. Right? Just trying to get at the idea that the distribution fundamentally changes, right? We still have these point masses, but where they are is different. Okay. And Gross and Wagner, what they did is they provided a complete description of the two kernels in 2 battlefield kind of scenarios, which seems simplistic, but what this is showing is that it's not nearly as easy as we think. Suppose that we just complicated a little bit and we went to 3 battles. And all of a sudden, this problem of what the equilibrium characterization was for this scenario, right, was unresolved for 50 years. It was unresolved for 50 years until an individual by the name of Brian Robertson came around. So I talked about Daniel Kovanoff, who's a co-author. This was his PhD student. Came around and showed, well, in this situation, kind of closed the door on the 3 battlefield scenario, and was able to say, well, in this situation, the equilibrium now takes on this form. So we moved away from something that looked like point mass distributions to rather be look like things now that look like uniform distribution. So here, so I'm not trying to present some form of a joint distribution over 3 battlefields. I'm presenting the marginals to you. So here, what does the marginal look like on battlefield 1? What does the marginal look like on battlefield 2 and 3? There's an underlying joint distribution that gets done. Okay, but the idea was, once again, is for 50 years we were stuck at two kernels, 2 fronts, and now all of a sudden Robertson in 2006 kind of cracked it open to now we can go to 3. Okay. And so the idea here, and really kind of what's at play here is kind of understanding, and what Robertson was able to crack, understand the structure of these marginal distributions and understanding whether or not there's a compatible joint distribution that will lend itself. Okay. But Robertson kind of just initiated another surge of research in this area. Takeaways up till now: randomization is extremely important, right? The structure of the randomization is highly specialized to the instance. We saw that in the 2 battlefield scenario, everything was point mass. As soon as we got to 3, we now got to uniform distribution. And finding the joint distributions, compatible joint distributions, was kind of a bottleneck to get in there. Okay. So brief history: 1921 was when these were first introduced. Gross and Wagner came, kind of did the complete version for the 2 battlefield scenario, kind of answered some partial questions for 3 battlefields and more. Robertson came along, kind of unlocked something even more by getting 3+ battlefields, asymmetric budgets, but required symmetric valuations, so all the B's to be the same. And then these were kind of extended later in 2014, 2018, but gains have been few and far between. Okay. Up until about the time of about maybe 2015, one started to study a variant of kernel Blotto called General Blotto. And what General Blotto did is it simplified the problem greatly. It said, well, rather than thinking about looking at strategies that have support over the simplex, said we're going to relax that constraint, and rather we're going to focus on strategies that meet our budget constraint and expectations. Okay, so here I'm just going to focus on the marginals associated with each one of the battlefields. I'm not going to worry, maybe I'll sometimes allocate more, maybe I'll sometimes allocate less than my budget, but I'm going to satisfy my budget constraint and expectations. Okay. Let me just highlight, just to make sure we're on the same page of what this means. So in this 3-5, in the kernel Blotto realm, if I require that my budget is satisfied with probability 1, here's my space of feasible allocations, and I'm going to look at probability distributions. In General Blotto, it says, well, what I could do is I could look at things more general. So here, so for example, let's imagine I adopted at front number 1, I do a uniform distribution. At front number 2, I do a uniform distribution. Notice that this satisfies my budget constraint and expectation, because here I'm on average, I'm going to, expectation, I'm going to allocate 3/2. Here's or 1 and 1, so I'm going to allocate 2 in expectation, but it need not satisfy it, right? Now there is a uniform distribution, right? If I do a uniform distribution, it's going to give me these marginals, but in general, if I deal with these marginals and I look at them in an independent fashion, it's not going to give me something that satisfies the budget constraint probability. And so why have people adopted this is really, it's been so hard to make gains in the kernel Blotto world. If we want to start enriching the models to tackle questions that are more relevant for us, we need to wiggle it a little bit. And so here in General Blotto, this is really the focus of really the work that's been emerging in the last 5 to 10 years, including our own. So once again, is this kind of emerged in 2008, 2015, 2020 with the idea of removing that coupling between, is there a compatible joint distribution was no longer an issue. We can just focus our analysis on marginals and go from there. Okay, so the idea here is that's kind of a closed book. Okay, and one thing that I want to highlight here is that all these results, pretty much to date, we're solving these min-max or these max-min problems. They all rely on this common knowledge assumption. What does that mean? It means that every agent, the 2 entities know their budget, they know their opponent's budget, and they know all the values. That's common knowledge. And what our goal was to start doing is in our entry into this is, well, maybe what we want to do is start relaxing that. So moving away from And so here, is look at informational asymmetries. And once again, the idea is if we're operating in a world where we're not certain about everything, the question then centers on is, well, should I invest in getting better information? Yes or no? Well, I need to know how that would change my equilibrium payoff, which is how I'm going to back out the value of that information to assess, is it worth the cost? So there's been some entry-level work into this area, but I think the perspective that we're taking has been a little different. Okay, so let's talk about some models of what this asymmetric information could be. Sorry, I don't know, I don't have a clock, so I'm just gonna grab my. Oh, okay, perfect. All right, so okay, so the idea here is that here's the picture that we're going to view, is that we have the blue agent versus the red agent. We're going to view that the blue is fully informed about the state of the world. So that's the person that we're competing against, and red is completely uninformed. And when we think about information, right, the idea is that the types of information that we're going to think that red could have access to is, do they have the battlefield valuation, yes or no? And do they know the opponent's budget? Yes. Okay. So in the first model that we consider, we're going to assume that they know the battle valuations, but they don't know the opponent. We're going to call that budget. In the second model that one could consider, which we have some results in this, is we're going to assume that they know the opponent's budget, but they have uncertainty regarding the budget. Okay. And so basically our main contributions that we've been able to do in each one of these domains is provide an equilibrium characterization and a characterization of the equilibrium. For simplicity, today, all I'm going to do is talk about the one. Right. So what we're going to have is we're going to have some notion of budget uncertainty, and red is going to be aware of the valuations of the battlefields, but it's not going to be aware of whether or not the blue is a high budget blue or a low budget blue, but he's going to have an underlying prior. All right. So here's the model that we're thinking about. Red, once again, blue could be one of two types, high budget or low budget. There's an underlying prior of P and 1 minus P on it. And red is going to be aware of the prior, but I'm not aware of the specific challenge. Okay. So what do we know is in this type of realm is what's blue going to have is when we start thinking about equilibrium strategies, blue could be one of two types, the high budget type or the low budget type. And in each one of these, he's going to have an underlying strategy. We'll call that strategy SA1 and SA2. Okay. Red is only going to be of a single type, and that's going to be just going to have its strategy SA2. Right. So when we think about this world where really A can only be of one of two budgets, these are the types of strategies that we're going to start looking at. We're going to start to ask is, well, can we find a Bayesian Nash? And our main result is absolutely, is what we've been able to do is characterize the Bayes Nash equilibrium for any set of parameters. And here the set of parameters that are relevant are just the high budget and the low budget of the blue player, the prior, and also the budget of the red player. So here it turns out, I'm not going to talk about the valuations of V1, V2, V3. It turns out that we're just going to view them as normalized, meaning that they sum up to 1, just to keep things simple. Okay. Now here's what this characterization looks like, right? So we're going to put in the parameters. We're going to specify the payoff here in terms of blue. Red is just going to be 1 minus that, right? But here's what the equilibrium characterization looks like. Is at the end of the day, it gets a little messy. So what happens is notice that we have all these different scenarios over here, XA1 and XA2. Just think about this as, the high budget and the low budget. So basically the high budget and the low budget is split up into these different regimes, right? And depending upon what regime that we live in, the form of the equilibrium payoff can potentially change. And so there's some nice connections to things like all pay auctions and stuff like that, with the idea of kind of deriving what these equilibrium payoffs are. But the idea here, once again, is a closed form analytical characterization of the equilibrium payoffs. And it gets a little messy, being that depending upon what regime we're in, and the regime is just kind of specified by the high budget, low budget pair, it potentially takes on a little bit of a different form. So the takeaways, once again, is distinct form of equilibrium strategies in these 5 regions. Don't worry about it. Just think about, in this domain, life is good. We know what's going to happen. The regions are defined by the relationship of the high and low budgets. And once again, this starts to identify the value of information and resource allocation. Once again, just to harp on this and why we think this is important, this tells us something about the change in equilibrium payoff with or without information. So once again, thinking about from the red side, if I know nothing, here's my equilibrium payoff. You could also say if I know something, here's what my equilibrium would be. Is getting that information worthwhile, yes or no? So here's just some simulations that kind of start to show you a little picture of how one might quantify that information. So here we have some specifics, not overly important. Here we're thinking about player A, budget of 5, high budget is 5, low budget is 1, and the prior maybe is 1/2. And so what this plot starts to show is, so here we're letting the x-axis be the budget of XB, so we're varying that. And what we're starting to see now is the dotted line is the scenario at which the red player is fully informed about the budget of blue. So think about the prior, the budget is realized and then red becomes aware of that realization. Versus the solid line is when red only knows the prior. Red does not aware of the realization. So what do we see is that the difference between these two curves quantifies how much improvement I could gain if red had that improvement. Okay. And so we can look at that, or we can plot this, just kind of plot that ratio out. And what do we see is that, when red has a low budget, you're getting 20 to 25% gains in performance by being aware of that information. Right? That's one way to quantify. How much would that information help? Well, if I had that information, it would improve my performance by an upwards of 20%, provided my budget was low. If my budget is high, I don't really need that information that much anyways, because I can just overwhelm them. Okay. Another way to quantify the value of information, which might even be more important, is rather than take a vertical slice, is take a horizontal slice. And so think about what are we doing here? We're fixing, right, our performance level that we want to gain, and we're trying to ask what's the least number of resources that's necessary for me to actually achieve that value, right? And so what do we see is that, with no information, it's at this point. With that better information, it's there. Once again, by looking at that horizontal slice, I can plot a similar picture. And what does this say is, well, with that better information, if I could have done just as well with 30% less assets, right? For certain regimes. Once again, if I'm big enough, it doesn't matter. But when we go back to our postcard example, right, drumming for more resources, right? If you're operating in the low resource regime, information can be extremely beneficial. Okay. So, there's variants that have been studied of this problem. One variation is where rather than XB being kind of given to you, you endowed with a particular budget. I can invest in budget and I pay a per unit cost of C associated with that investment. So C is some number greater than or equal to 0. And one now, red is tasked with deciding how much budget do I invest in and how do I deploy that budget. Not to delve onto it in any way, but one can write a complementary equilibrium characterization and equilibrium payoffs in this domain, right? And there's a nice duality between this per unit cost realm and this fixed budget realm. And so if you can do one, you pretty much get the other side for free. Right, what we can do. Okay, and once again, is we could start in this realm, once again, assessing the value of information style question. How would my investment level change depending upon whether I had no information, some information? Okay. So that kind of wraps up kind of the first contribution that I wanted to talk to you guys about today. And once again, that's where I said the bulk of the time would be. We'll spend some time on the other stuff as well. But the takeaways from this so far was that, well, number one is from the red's perspective, attaining information can significantly improve outcome in strategic, right? So information is helpful, especially if I have a low budget or maybe a high per unit cost. And now from the blues perspective, one can take the analog perspective is that, well, from a blue is if I'm able to confuse an opponent, so induce some incomplete information, then actually that might can significantly improve my outcome, right? So I want to obfuscate whatever information I can about myself. And so what I want to do is I want to play on this confusing idea a little bit. And that's going to lead us into our second kind of problem of well, how do we choose to allocate assets over time? Okay. So once again, this was the main question. Well, how do we distribute a common pool of resources to maximize total gains? This was what's known as the commander assignment problem. It was introduced by Kovanoff and Robertson back in 2021 or 2012. And so once again, the idea is I have a pool of resources, X. I have multiple independent tasks. Here, I'm just highlighting 2 for simplicity. The question is how do I divide these tasks, or how do I divide this fixed pool of assets between task 1 and task 2? And so when we think about each one of these pictures, well, how do we derive the benefit in a particular task? Is, well, what does this look like? This looks like just a kernel Blotto or general Lotto game. And so once we have kind of do some form of an allocation of an XA1 and XA2 that satisfies our budget constraint, what do we have over here is, well, the performance in this task, we can kind of capture and model it as just the equilibrium payoff of the general Lotto game. Okay, and so that's what Kovanoff and Robertson did. And what they were able to do is in closed form is write down a solution for what the optimal deterministic split division of assets would be. Okay, so once again, they were on to a lot of different things that I think is extremely relevant to our community. And one of them was I thought this result was, here's how I should divide my assets to maximize my cumulative gains, meaning my performance in task 1 plus my performance in task 2. And nailed it. So the question that we wanted to ask is, well, why restrict our attention to deterministic allocations? They restricted attention to deterministic allocations. Why? So that this block was well understood, right? And what does it mean is I could write down the general Lotto games. Randomization induces an incomplete information environment. One didn't have a characterization of the equilibrium payoffs associated with that. So can randomization do better? What would randomization potentially be? Is, once again, this isn't the optimal strategy, but this is just highlighting what it'd be. Flip a coin, give all the budget to the task on the left, flip another, if it's heads, if it's tails, put all the budget on the left. Okay. Well, when we start thinking about this realm, what do we have? This is exactly a scenario that we depicted in contribution 1, right? What do we have? We have some level of budget uncertainty. Red is unaware of whether or not blue is a 0 budget person or an X budget person, but maybe is aware of the prior, right? And where's this prior coming from? It's not something that's just endowed from above. Rather, this commander, the central commander, the central entity is deciding exactly what this would be. Okay. So once again, the question that we want to ask is, well, could randomization lead better? And that's where our kind of our second main result that I want to highlight is this. Is that actually when, kind of in some, here we're going to satisfy budget constraints and expectation. We're going to focus in the realm of per unit cost, right? So that's some of the underlying assumptions. But the takeaway point is that randomization can help, and not just help, right? It can actually give a factor of 2 improvement, meaning that by randomizing, you could double your performance relative to the best deterministic strategy of Kovanoff and Robertson. You can double it, right? Just by doing some degree of randomization. Okay. Once again, we could go through a simulation. So here, it's just some parameters for completeness. What do we have? We have, we're looking at kind of randomization strategies of the form where we're going to have a high and low budget and split it, and some underlying distribution that we're going to choose, which is here, kind of P. And so all of a sudden, what do we have over here is this is the plot that's more interesting, is what this solid line highlights is when our pool size is X. What it's highlighting is how the best deterministic division of assets performs. And so what do we see? We get some performance along that fashion, right? That's what the solid line does. What the dotted line shows is the performance and expectation of the best randomized division of assets, right? And that's this line over here. So what do we see is if once again, if we take that vertical slice, right, the difference tells us how much improvement that we're moving from by going from the optimal deterministic division to the optimal randomized division of assets. And so here, what do we see is we get 100% improvement. We've doubled our performance by doing it. Once again, we could take, kind of the horizontal slice as well and say, well, how much budget could we have saved by doing something a little better? And here it's even more kind of astronomical in the standpoint that what we're observing here is when we're low, is we could have achieved the same type of performance guarantees, albeit in expectation, right? With 75% less budget. right? So these are significant, right? And just highlighting randomization plays a fundamental role. And here's some illustrations of that in terms of if we want to enhance performance or we want to keep our performance level constant, but diminish our budget. Okay. So that kind of is really a nutshell. It kind of wraps up at least the first two, right? We have the analysis side, and then we exploit that analysis in this commander assignment problem, right? To induce these incomplete information scenarios to maximize improvement. Here we see these twofold improvement. Okay. The last part that I want to do is I'm going to spend a slide on maybe talk about 3 different emerging problems in the kernel Blotto that I think we're gunning for, with the hope that maybe some people in the audience kind of jump on the Blotto ship. So here we go. So one of the directions, and I already kind of highlighted this before. Once again, the formality of this talk is done. We're gonna wave our hands and kind of paint pictures of what theorems could be. But really was this idea of moving beyond summables, right? Looking at structures that are more relevant to problems that we're dealing with. One of these structures that we've been thinking about is perimeter defense or path connectivity through a network. And here is thinking about things like that. So here, what blue does is blue derives benefit from securing a path in a network. And once again, that path could be a perimeter that secures some area in the network. A path could just be a mode of transportation or a realm for transportation through that network as well. And how does blue secure that? Well, blue secures an edge in the network only if it secures the 2 battlefields neighboring, the 2 adjacent battlefields. So here, once again, the boxes are all the fronts that we're competing over. If I secure the 2 endpoints, the 2 adjacent, I get the edge. Now, if red can secure any one of the adjacent battlefields, then this edge no longer belongs to blue, but rather red. And once again, this is just one model of how we could choose to model network effect. Is once again, this, getting this battlefield in its own right gets you no benefit. It only gets you benefit if you get this one plus that one, or this one plus that one, or this one plus that one, right? Edges are valuable, not individual value. Okay. So what have we been able to do in this realm? At least here's an informal statement of our result, and it's contained in this paper right over here. Is I can tell you we can provide a full characterization of what the equilibrium look like for any bipartite graph. So we're kind of restricted into bipartite with regard to here's your equilibrium characterization of it. And if we move beyond bipartite, I can give you bounds on equilibrium chaos, but I can't tell you specifically what. Right. And once again, just with this idea of pushing the boundary of moving from summable objectives to things that might be more relevant and more applicable to our community. Okay. Another direction that's been gaining a little bit of steam is moving beyond 2 players, right? It's not always the case that we're sitting in a scenario where it's 1 versus 1. It could be many versus 1, or it could be many versus many, right? And so how would one start to analyze those types of scenarios? Do we see the same things emerge in the single scenario in the 1 versus 1 as in the 2 versus 1 or 2 versus 2? How do we start to look at that? And so things that we once again explored in an informal way is that these presence of these third entities opens up a spectrum of strategic options, right? That one wouldn't naturally view as something that would be strategically beneficial. And I can just highlight one that's in this is we could think about, well, if I'm the blue agent, let's imagine that the blue and the green agent, they're independent entities. They care about their local performance. But they don't, like, blue doesn't care what happens to green. Green does not care what happens to blue, right? They're entities, but they're both kind of facing a common adversary, red. We got our Amazon of the world is sitting down here, and here's all of our, kind of our companies that are going against the big man, right? And so what do we have over here? It's, well, what are the options I can deploy? But should I ever do anything different? And so one of the thoughts is, well, could a player ever benefit by conceding? Just saying, hey, I'm not going to compete in some markets, right? And publicly declaring that. And all these interesting forms of kind of strategic options kind of emerge in these multiple versus 1 and these multiple versus multiple scenario, such as concessions, such as kind of, which is the next topic that I'll talk about is revealing information. Is there's a rich body of work. And once again, I kind of pass the baton and I highlight kind of some of the foundational work by Kovanoff and Robertson in this realm, who've touched on lots of different models in this realm with very, very, very interesting outcomes that at least I've found deeply inspiring and motivating for some of the directions that I want to go in. And this kind of was just one of them. The other one is kind of along the same vein. We can think about, a constant theme throughout today has been information and incomplete information, with the idea that less information is worse than having more information. Well, when we get to a many versus many scenario, or even a one versus many scenario, that actually no longer is necessarily the case anymore. And so here, something in my arsenal, if I'm trying to utilize my assets correctly, some form of strategic information dissemination can actually be in my spectrum of control choices. Meaning that if I'm green, is there some public declarations I should make about maybe what my intentions are, what I care about, or so forth, right? Is there, obviously strategically, how I choose to deploy my forces is one thing. What information I choose to send out into the world is also something else, right? And what we've started to emerge is that sending information out in the world, and this isn't rubbish, this is actually like truthful information about what I intend to do, what I am going to do, actually can be strategically beneficial, right? So everything that I told you in the one versus one, where, hey, blue wants to, kind of keep red as uninformed as possible, right? In the one versus one, that's true. In the one versus many, that falls away, right? Is that, hey, making red a little bit more informed, making the rest of people a little bit more informed about who I am, actually can be in my best interest. And we find that kind of cute and interesting and inspiring to kind of think about adding another arsenal to our control landscape and what we're going to do, what we're going to think about. So with that, I really want to thank all of you for your attention and for sharing this last hour with me. Here is some representative papers that I talked about today. Feel free, if you want any access to it, you can either contact me or Keith, and we'll be happy to share or comment anything. And obviously I need to thank the funding agencies that made this work possible, and thank you to the organizing committee for having me here. So thank you very much.